In this video I want to show you how we can use the buffering feature in GIS in order to positively or negatively buffer particular features. And I'll tell you why we might want to do that in some of these cases. Now, even though this is a familiar example, these are polluting facilities in the Denver area and these are census tracts in the background, even though they're sized by the amount of pollution here, if I were to spatially join these particular points to the underlying census tracts, actually what would happen is that it does a count that each of these dots gets counted up in its respective census tract. And even if I'm zoomed out a little bit, you know, for example, the dot appears to cover more than one census tract. In fact, that dot will only get counted in that one particular census tract. And you may not want that to happen. For example, here we have a facility right here that's right near the border of a census tract, and it doesn't really seem fair that this particular census tract doesn't get counted as being impacted by this particular facility. So what we want to do is buffer this particular point such that the new buffered point encompasses more than just that one census tract. And then when we spatially join it, both this tract and this one, and even possibly this one, gets counted as being affected or having a facility present. On the negative side, it's often the case where you might have a, let's say a brownfield area, for example, that perfectly encompasses, let's say, this census tract right here, and the borders kind of match up. Now, if we were to spatially join that, if that particular polygon of that brownfield area is actually touching a border of another census tract, then not only does this census tract get counted as being affected, but if it's sharing a border, this one gets affected and this one gets affected as well. So you might want to negatively buffer and sort of pull them in a little bit before you actually do the spatial joining. So I'm just going to go ahead and change these into regular old dots. Okay. Now, to do the buffering, you just go to geoprocessing, and there's buffer right there. And this is where you're going to have to rely on, in some ways, common sense. The literature is often, buffering often happens in some of the research in these in this area, and so you'll check what kinds of distances people use when they're buffering. Once we get this menu to pop up, of course it's being really slow right now, so I'm going to go ahead and pause while we wait for that. Okay, now that the buffer window has appeared, it's pretty simple. The input feature is what we want to buffer, so I'm going to select Denver facilities here. And the output feature, again, it's always going to try to save to some default place. So you want to make sure it saves to wherever you're saving your material. And I'm just going to save it. I'll just call it Den Facility Buff. And then you get this linear unit and decimal degree. First of all, you can switch this to something, and you might end up using meters, let's say 100 meters, 200 meters, or so on, or you can use miles. And so let's just use miles, 0.25. So what it's going to do is it's going to take every point and create a new point that's essentially buffered by a quarter-mile radius in every direction from that particular point. Now, let's say you were working with polygons, again, the particular areas that are cover over census tracts and border others, and you want to kind of pull those in. You might just do something like pull in 100 feet, do a negative. Obviously I can't do it with this particular kind of data, but you could do that if you were working with polygons. So we'll do that and make sure it's saving, looks good, and hit OK. And you'll see that eventually it'll start to buffer down here on the bottom right. And while we wait for that, I'm going to go ahead and hit the pause button. Oh, there it's going. I guess I'll wait. And a new shapefile emerges. And you can see that it pops up here. I'm going to move that up to the top. Now you can't hardly see it, but when I zoom in, you'll see what's going on here. You can see that these new disks are these buffered points that, in contrast to these other dots, which again, the reason you can only see them is because I've got them sized to a certain degree, but they're actually very specific points. but these larger buffered points, if I were to spatially join this point to the census tracts underneath, you'd see this census tract would get counted, this one would get counted, and this one would get counted, and so on. Whereas before, this point would only count for the particular census tract it was in. So that's how you can do buffering. Now the other thing about these buffers is that they themselves can become cases. Let's say each of these was a school instead of a polluting facility. So now we have schools with a particular buffered area around it, and we might want to plot incidences of vandalism or crime, and we want to know if particular schools and the areas around schools have more crime. And so we might be able to spatially join incidences of crime to these particular buffered areas. And so in that case, once I had my other things plotted, I could go ahead and do the spatial join using these buffered areas as my actual cases, not the census tracts. So that's how you can use buffers.